The purpose of an Angular controller is to provide support to the view. The code in the controller defines the model required by the view. The controller retrieves data as needed and exposes it for the view to use for binding. In our application, it will provide product data. The controller takes the place of the ng-init attribute that we are currently using for our binding source. Code in the controller also implements the methods for any actions that the view can perform. In our application, the only action currently defined for the view is to hide and show the images, so our controller will provide a method to implement that action. How do you build a controller that can define the model and implement the actions for a view? By first defining a controller function. The controller function contains the definition of the model and the methods for any actions that the view can perform. Once the controller function is created, the view identifies its controller function using the ng-controller directive. The ng-controller directive specifies the controller by its logical name, not its physical file name, even though in many cases those names are the same. For Angular to find the associated controller function, the controller function can be defined in the global namespace. This technique is often used during prototyping when the controller function is defined directly in the HTML file. For real applications, the controller function is instead registered with one of the application's modules. The module can then look up the function by its name. Since we are building a real, albeit fictitious, application, we will use the registration technique. Using the registration technique, the steps to creating a controller are as follows. Start by defining the immediately invoked function expression, or IFE. This function will wrap around the entire contents of the controller and ensure none of the controller code is defined in the global namespace. Also, though not shown here, be sure to add useStrict. Then look up the module. We need to register the controller with a module, so we must first have a reference to that module. We can look up the module using the module getter syntax. That returns a reference to the module. Then we can register the controller with the module. This is done using the controller method of the module. The first parameter of the controller method is the string name of the controller, in this case, product list controller. The second parameter is an array. The first elements in the array are the string names of the parameters to the controller function. In this case, there is only one parameter, and it's named $scope. We'll talk more about $scope shortly. The last element of the array is always the controller function itself. The purpose of defining the parameter names in this array is to ensure that if the controller code is ever minified, that Angular can understand the parameter names. If you're not familiar with the minification process, it is the process by which JavaScript files are reduced in size by removing white space and reducing the size of variables, including function parameters. Minification will change the function parameters to one-character names, but Angular expects specific parameter names. By defining the parameter names in an array, Angular will correctly handle the controller parameters. If you are certain that the code will never be minified, you can skip the array here and instead pass the controller function in as the second parameter. The last step, of course, is to write the actual code for the controller. That code will go here. Before jumping into the code for the controller, let's talk more about the controller parameter, $scope. $scope is a built-in Angular object that provides communication between the view and the controller. In this diagram, the view is shown on the left, and the controller is here on the right. By defining $scope as a parameter to a controller function, Angular injects the built-in $scope object into the controller, something like this. The controller then augments the scope, adding the model for the view binding, and defining methods for any view actions. The directives and expressions in the view can then bind to the model properties or call the controller methods. But there is an alternative to injecting $scope. Angular version 1.2 introduced a way to bind the model and methods to the controller directly instead of using $scope. This technique is often called the controller as syntax. Using this syntax, you don't need to pass $scope into the controller. The models and methods are defined directly on the controller itself. In the view, the model and methods are referenced using an alias that is defined in the ng-controller directive. The $scope still exists, but it's behind the scenes, and you'll see later in this course that it is still needed by some third-party modules. Notice the slight difference in the ng-controller directive syntax. It now has an as clause that defines the alias, hence the controller as moniker. Many examples define the alias as VM for view model because it's short and its purpose is clear, but you can use any alias name. For example, in this case, we might want to just use product. The directives and expressions in the view can then bind to the model properties or call the controller methods using that alias and a dot syntax. When building a controller, there are a few best practices to keep in mind. Define each controller in a separate .js file. This means that each controller script file will be separately downloaded from the server, so each controller needs a script tag in the index.html file. Consider adding that script tag immediately after defining the new .js file, otherwise it's easy to forget. By defining each controller in a separate .js file, you keep your concerns separated. Most variables and functions in JavaScript are camel case, but controllers should be Pascal case. That means the first letter of each word of the name is capitalized. Suffix the controller with controller or CTRL. This recommendation has had its share of controversy. Some developers don't want to use abbreviations. Some developers don't want to use suffixes at all. This course uses CTRL as a suffix because it's shorter and makes it easier for the code to fit in the screenshots. My recommendation is for the team to decide on a convention and stick to it. The final recommendation is to always wrap controllers in an immediately invoked function expression, or IFE, just like we did with the module. In some cases, it may not be needed, but by always having it, if code is later added to the controller or the controller is refactored, the IFE will always be in place. So let's create our controller.